So the question is, can Canada compete in a way that reflects our values? To dig into that question, I'm joined by former Finance Minister Bill Mourneau, someone who's been at the heart of how Canada grows, invests, and competes. I'm Emily Madden. This is the MNL Show. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Bill. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's great for me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great. So the conversation we're having today is, can Canada compete? And we talked about having a conversation that puts a little bit of the talent perspective, specifically investment in talent, and how Canada sees itself on sort of the global economic stage. Can you maybe just start by helping me understand why we're having this conversation? What does competitiveness actually mean? Maybe help us with some practical kind of terms for Canadians. You know, when we think about jobs, when we think about the future, like, why are we having these conversations about competition, competitiveness?
I think it's a great place to start. From my perspective, really, the reason this dialogue is happening between people like you and me, but so many people in our communities, is because we're reading the newspapers, we're seeing on TV, we're understanding that the challenge to be successful, to be competitive as a country in 2025 is much different than it was in 1945 or 1985. Seriously, the challenge is different. Obviously, as the growth of the global economy is successful in so many places, then it makes us realize that for us to continue to be at the front edge, to provide great opportunities, whether it's for our people or for our businesses, is more challenging because it's a competitive world. That is combined with a real sense of angst right now that the level of productivity growth in our country is not what we'd want. So when you think about that, my starting frame is to remember that growth is easier when you're not as developed. I call it the gravity of growth. You think about putting in place the first airport in a community, all of a sudden productivity goes up.
Right.
People are able to come back and forth to the city. It enhances business success. Well, the second airport, it doesn't do quite as much. So as you've grown, as you've seen growth, as you've developed things, whether it's houses or the business sector, then to keep growing is increasingly difficult. And of course, there's regulatory frameworks that become important to make sure that, you know, if it's putting in place housing, to make sure that the rules work, that people don't get, you know, hit by a car, you know. So there's issues that slow down things just because we've grown, and we need those regulatory frameworks. So that's really where we are in 2025, a sense that the growth that we experienced for years is starting to flatten off, and a question of how do you rejuvenate your society given that reality. And it's really critical because you're really thinking about how do you create opportunities for the next generation? Right. So, you know, the promise of Canada for all of the last generations since the Second World War has been that one generation is going to do better than the one before. So there's always a sense of optimism. And that is a challenge if you don't see the growth, because if you're not seeing growth, then people aren't going to invest. And if people don't invest, then you're not going to see the growth. So there becomes a bit of a challenge that you need to overcome. You need to have a sense of optimism to get there. That's in the air. That's what people are worried about. And I think that's exacerbated by what's going on around us in the world. You know, as you see supply chains change because the US and China are competing for global supremacy, both economically and geopolitically, as you see increasingly, you know, a country like the United States trying to rejig the world economy and think about supply chains in a way that is going to advance their economy, then you worry when you're in Canada. We're a trade-exposed country that, as global dynamics change, as the US changes the deal that it wants for itself, it presents real issues for Canada. So that's a bit of a long-winded way to say that's the angst that we're feeling right now.
Right.
But I'm always optimistic. I mean, it seems to me that you have to understand the angst. You start there in order to think about, what are you going to do? How are you going to actually deal with that challenge in a way that's going to be practical and optimistic so that, in fact, you can move forward?
I like the optimism angle, and I'm unsurprised to hear it from you. But let's stay with the angst for a second. And there's a piece that you framed around the need to continuously invest. I know that you have written about and have spoken about some of the concerns about the kind of lagging business investment in talent, or business investment in sort of a per worker. Can you talk a little bit about what you think that's driving in that? So specifically in Canada, do we have a policy problem? Is it a cultural thing? Is there something different about the structure of the way that we do business in Canada? What do you think is attributing to that kind of gap in investment per worker in the talent?
Well, I think, first of all, we just need to acknowledge that it's a real thing. I mean, we are not investing as much as we should be. If we look at Canada versus OECD countries, so that's the club of rich countries around the world, we are just not investing as much per capita as other countries are, neither in overall investment nor in research and development investment. And if you're thinking that you can be competitive, but you're investing 60 cents on the dollar of your closest competitor, you're probably kidding yourself. So as a starting point, it is true that we're not investing enough. So the question then becomes, why aren't we, and how do we change that situation? So, in the first instance, why aren't we? I mean, I think we've got some natural advantages. We're beside the U.S. market. So obviously, if you're a business, sometimes you think you can be a fast follower against U.S. investment. So there's some geographical dynamics that do provide opportunities for businesses to, potentially invest less because they can see what's going on south of the border. I know when I ran my business, we didn't always try to be the very first person, but we sure tried to be the first person in Canada. And that meant that sometimes we could piggyback on some investments in the United States that had already been made, know-how that we could understand and move forward rapidly on. So there is that dynamic, but I think we also need to recognize that we have a large country that obviously has markets separated by that long geographical barrier, and sometimes that means people are producing for smaller markets, so maybe not investing as much as they should. Interprovincial trade barriers have been an issue, and there's something that I think appropriately has been identified by the current government to break down. But then there's more than that. There is a question about whether we see that regulatory burdens are not making the investment work for all sectors of the economy. And obviously, when you move to the natural resources sector, whether it's in mining or in oil and gas, they've seen some barriers to investment, some that are just the way that the world exists. I mean, we obviously have to do Indigenous reconciliation if we're going to put big projects across big territories, and that takes time. It takes time. Similarly, we have a division of powers. If you think about natural resources, the resource development might be the responsibility of the province, but the interprovincial movement of goods is the federal responsibility. So there needs to be a cooperation and coordination. So there are barriers that we need to deal with, but that investment challenge is real, and understanding it is the starting point, thinking about how are you going to deal with it. And that's, I think, happily what the government's trying to think about right now.
So you're describing it's all three. There is a little bit of a cultural piece. There is a little bit of a structural way to the way that business is done, and there's some policy issues. We're having interesting conversations in Newfoundland as part of our Spotlight in Atlantic Canada last week, and the issue of building data centers in Labrador came up, and kind of the policy challenges with, what do you invest in now in terms of ROI versus what do you invest in later? So a complex problem. Let's try to maybe move it a little bit. What if we were to just take a policy angle on it and we put talent at the core, we put talent at the center? So We think about things like education, skills, immigration, inclusion. What are some of the most powerful levers that Canada has at its disposal that we could pull, say, in the next 5 years when it comes to investing in talent?
I think it's really appropriate to be thinking about talent because, none of this, we can talk about natural resources, we can talk about how lucky we are as a country to have, undefended borders, 3 oceans and a long undefended border of the United States. But the fact of the matter is nothing happens without great people. And if we think about what Canada's special historic advantage has been, and I think what our opportunity is going forward, is that we can really be a place because of the nature of our country, the starting point, peace, order, and good government, where people can see that they can lead a fulfilling life with their family. So it really is a place where around the world people look and say, that's a place I'd love to live.
Yeah.
And we've been really successful at building a strong educational system, a secondary educational system. But obviously, you need to maximize those opportunities. You need to think about the people that are here. You need to think about your country as a beacon of opportunity for people who aren't here. So there's a few things underneath that you need to worry about from a policy standpoint. For the people that are here, you need to think about how are you maximizing their opportunities? How are you making sure that they understand the signals about where they should be specializing so that they can be really effective contributors and have a more successful career or a more enriching life because they've added more value? So you need to think about how they move from education into the workforce and go through training so they actually maximize their potential. So that's a series of challenges that are not easy to get right. Then you need to think about, in our case, an immigration system. I mean, we have had an immigration system for generations that's been so successful. Yeah. The idea that we could bring people here, that we could enable them to become part of our country and part of the success, that's been a really great success story. Of course, in the last few years, we've gotten that wrong. So in the post-pandemic era, with a rapid increase in temporary foreign workers and with some overly ambitious agendas around how many new people could come to Canada, we found ourselves in a situation where the long-held support of Canadians by Canadians for immigration has been more challenged. And so we need to get back to remembering that for us to be successful, we do want people to be able to come here. We want the best and the brightest to come. We need people who can add to the effectiveness and the opportunity in Canada for Canadians and for themselves. So that it means we need to be very careful about how we think about that immigration system. And once people get here, how we're going to land them, how we're going to help them to be successful, how they can become part of that same system of education, getting into the workforce, training so that the effectiveness can be there. So these are very real policy challenges. They're important. But if you're thinking about where in the world would you rather face up to these challenges? And I think this is what leads me to optimism. People, I think they recognize that Canada is a great place to live. If you look at any world ranking of where people want to live, Canada, in particular, some of our most important cities come right near the very top of the ranking. And yet the productivity, the growth don't. So there's the opportunity. People want to be here. So now we need to find a way to realize from that opportunity, the opportunities of growth for everyone. So that to me that's the magic of good public policy.
I think the concept of, there's a bit of a PR layer to this. I think if I'm maybe hearing you correctly, in terms of what does the Canadian standard of living and lifestyle look like? You mentioned about taking care of the talent stream that we actually have in Canada. And I want to talk a little bit about lifelong learning and about skills development. This is a very important thing when we think about workforce and economic development. And I used to think about lifelong learning as kind of a pitch for sort of that Con Ed programming, right? Like lifelong learning is great, but like, is that something that I'm thinking about for me? Or is that something that I'm thinking about, for somebody else? And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on where things like upskilling and reskilling and continuously learning belong in sort of the Canadian talent conversation.
Well, to me, we've talked about a couple things so far. We've talked about the challenge in investment and the need to unleash more investment through addressing regulatory barriers, making sure that we create opportunity for people to make investments and see that something comes from that. Obviously, on the other side of the coin, if you're going to make an investment, you want to know that you have the people that can realize the potential in that investment. And in a world where our economy is moving so rapidly, I mean, if we think about the dynamics of the world of 2025 versus 10, 20, and 40 years ago, speed is one of the really important dynamics. Yeah. Things are moving really rapidly. And with that change means people need to be able to adapt. So what was a nice to have 25 years ago, people 40 years ago, say people had this idea that they were going to enter the workforce at whatever age, 18 or 20 or 22, and work for however many years, 30 to 40 years, and retire. That's not the way it looks anymore. And we need to acknowledge that the idea of a job that is consistent for those 30 to 40 years is, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, a thing of the past. So how do we make sure people have the capacity to make an impact in that new world? They have no choice but to rethink core principles. What do I need to be good at in order to be successful in a changing world? And so when we have added on top of that artificial intelligence, which means people who are going to be able to be even more successful are those that are going to be able to use the tools and to develop them in order to actually allow for us to move even faster. It just tells you that how we develop and give people access to training and development is going to be critically important. And our society's, frankly, not necessarily architected that way right now. I mean, universities are increasingly thinking about it, which is great. How do they help people, with shorter courses at particular times in their career? What are the ways people can get training that are, maybe not in a campus situation, but in other sorts of environments? These are important things for us to think about. And, organizations like Magnet that are actually trying to be the one that is helping to connect, the people who want the skills with the kinds of training opportunities that they need to get there, and the eventual organization that's going to need to use those talents. That's critically important.
It's giving multiple accountability streams, right? So there is exactly as you said. On one point, we're talking about businesses investing in their workers, but we're also talking about how education institutions are rethinking kind of the multiple streams and carrying that talent through, what policies are enabled or enacted to be able to support these things. But there's also I think you're speaking to kind of a personal investment, like a personal responsibility. I also, I'm going to have Canada show up for me and ensure that I can have the best opportunities that I can have. I also need to invest in myself in terms of continuously upskilling. It's a very interesting way of looking at it. And on the accountability piece, I wanted to just talk a little bit about, I've heard you talk recently a little bit about Australia's Productivity Commission. And I know that we have some institutions, the Bank of Canada and some think tanks, and there's provincial initiatives and things like that. But I don't think we have anything quite like this. Can you just kind of describe what it is and what you think a Canadian version of this might look like?
I think you're identifying some of the things that I was talking about in my book, but also things that I talked a lot about while I was in office. And I think what we have to recognize is that when we need to make change, when we're seeing that things aren't working, we need to ask ourselves, what do we need to do differently? And so getting to core principles is really critically important. So, the fact of the matter is we're not investing enough. The numbers don't lie. I mean, we've been investing less than our competitive countries, as I mentioned. We are on track to be one of the slowest growth countries on a per capita basis over the next 50 years if we don't change that. And I have every confidence that we will. But in order to say we will, we need to know what is it that we will change. And so the idea behind some form of prosperity task force, or in the Australian situation on Australian Productivity Commission, is say, what are the things we need to do differently?
Right.
You know, in the Canadian context, you know, are there barriers for us to make investments in big infrastructure? Well, the answer is yes. And, you know, the recent decision of the federal government to start a new, you know, major projects office is really identifying that as a real challenge. How do we think about those important projects that must get done and find a way to remove or fast track against regulatory issues that are creating, you know, burdens or at least time lags? So we need to think about what specifically do we need to do? And that's across all aspects of our society. So if we don't have enough housing, what's the barrier for us to have the housing that we need? Is it that we don't have the right planning that goes on at a municipal level? Is it that we have taxation barriers? Is it that we don't have a way to hire the people that need to be there in order to build the homes? I mean, there's multiple things you need to think about. We need to think about all those and come up with practical steps to actually make those things happen. So that's really what I've been advocating for. And, you know, it is more or less important depending on the attitude and goals of the government in place. And I'm happy to see that the current government, and I think there's an increasing discussion across Canada, so I don't want to identify just one government, realizes that we need to get on top of this. And I think what's happened, if you want to see a silver lining in the fact that Donald Trump, as the president of the United States, has said that he's looking at how he can rethink the tariff situation, which actually has really challenging issues for Canada. Silver lining is it makes Canadians say, okay, we need to think about how we can do best against our challenges. What can we do differently so that we can maximize our own potential, whether it's fixing things that aren't working, creating incentives for things that we know we need to create incentives for, rethinking our immigration system, or pivoting to marketing to other countries around the world. All those things are necessary at the same time. And we need to, you know, as a society, come together to make sure we don't lose this moment.
Yeah, I think that was very well said. And I agree with you on the silver lining comment. I think what we've seen certainly in the last 9 months, year, has been really that kind of Canadian conversation that feels a little bit more neighborly and internal, wherein I think we do tend to, and I think you said earlier, compare ourselves a little bit to other countries and certainly our neighbors, right? And we see, you know, we kind of think of ourselves maybe a little bit in that way, but recently we have been really kind of focused on the Canadian culture or identity, or that conversation has somehow gotten a little bit louder. I'm hearing it a little bit more. So moving on to that particular area, the Canadian kind of, I don't know, identity, I guess, for lack of a better word. How do you think that we see ourselves on the global stage? Like, how do we as Canadians see ourselves in terms of our unique kind of style?
Well, you know, my view is that we do have a unique and very successful approach globally, and that the Canadian way of doing things is different. And in some ways it presents challenges, but in other ways it presents big opportunities. I think the nature of our country means that we, and this is all comparative, but that we are more successful at getting to consensus than many other countries. If you think about it, we started as a country, you know, two separate identities had to work together for, you know, generations to figure out a way to come together on issues. We had to build across a very long geography so that we could actually be part of the same country. So there's an instinct towards consensus that is strong. You know, some would say, well, doesn't that come along with things taking a little longer, with a sense of caution? You know, I talked earlier about peace, order, and good government. I mean, that doesn't always get the blood stirring, but by the same token, what it means is that for most Canadians, it's a pretty great place to live. Yeah. And we recognize that in a place where we find a way to live together, challenging as it is sometimes, that can be pretty great. And when we do get to conclusions, those conclusions are more likely to last. I can tell you, having run a business, that when I developed a relationship in Canada versus when I developed a relationship in other countries, I had a great deal of confidence that those relationships in Canada could stand the test of time. Not always perfectly, of course, like anywhere else, but you could see that the willingness to work together to get to better outcomes was always there. So I think there's really something to be said for that Canadian advantage. And that also is one of the things that enables us to be successful with immigration. We're able to bring in people, and over generations, we brought people from different parts of the world that have been able to successfully become part of Canada. So obviously, you need to do that in a way that recognizes that you're investing at the right pace, so you can have the services and the things that people need, both people that are already here and people that we're inviting to come here. But that has been something that, the nature of Canada has enabled that. And for sure, given demographic trends, and this is not just a Canadian issue, but an issue for pretty well all Western democratic nations, that is a real issue. If you're not successful at bringing people to your country, you're going to find yourself demographically challenged, because we are not producing enough babies to continue to have the population growth that we want if we want to create opportunities for the next generation.
Right. So do you think, I'm hearing consensus building, cautious. I've also, we're pretty innovative here and fairly resilient. Are we innovators? Are we cautious adapters? Are we risk averse? Does Canada have a talent brand?
I guess I could push that back to you, given what you do. But it seems to me that, of course, we've got a really great educational system in our country. We have a highly educated workforce. We have places in the country where there's clusters of people who work together in sectors that create real innovation. I think we need to do more of that. I think we need to make sure that we're investing in places where we have an existing differential advantage so that we can get better and better and better. If there's one lesson as you look around the world, you see that the places, often it's not necessarily countries, but smaller parts of countries where people come together and innovation happens because they're people taking risks, working together and learning from each other. We have a lot of opportunity for that in multiple sectors, advanced manufacturing, in the ag sector, in the natural resources sector. So there's places where we can be very successful. Digital economy is another place. So thinking about how we enhance those places by ensuring that we attract people, that we give them the ability and work with them so that they can get the skills they need in order to help push the envelope. That's where innovation happens.
Yeah. Okay, let's dip just before we finish up here. I just want to dip out of the optimism for half a minute. We'll get back there. So we're talking a lot about investment. There's obviously going to be risks of inaction, right? There's going to be the concept of a lower standard of living, which we talked about at the top. Why is this conversation important? Can you, try not to scare us too much, but paint us a bit of a picture of what it might look like if we fail to act, to invest in talent, and to continue to grow and move our productivity and competitiveness in the right direction?
I always think that, there is sometimes too much drama around this. So we need to remember that the arc of the last 150 years has been pretty great. So against human history, growth was relatively modest for a very, very long time. Starting around the mid 19th century, all of a sudden, changing approaches to innovation, the lab, companies that were now able to be limited liability companies. These things came together to help for innovation that really changed the dynamics of Western economies. So we've come a very, very long way. So yes, there can be a flattening. If you think about what's the risk of flattening and less growth if we don't actively think about how we break down barriers to that growth right now. And what that would mean, unfortunately, would be that there'd be more opportunities for lack of harmony between generations. We're seeing it right now. Obviously, it is not as great in 2025 to be 25 than it was in 1975, because the potential for growth is different. And that's to a great extent driven by demographics. So we just have a different demographic situation. So now we need to think about, how do we create opportunity for young people? How do we think about our system working for them? Because if people aren't optimistic about the future, they don't make investments.
Right.
And if they don't make investments, we don't have growth. So you do need to recognize that those opportunities are critical. That's why housing is so critical. You know, if people can't see themselves finding a way to have a place for themselves and their family that's, you know, maybe different, but that's allows them to realize their goals, then it's hard to be optimistic. So it is really important to get some of those fundamentals right. But I think we will. I mean, against a challenging moment where we've had more growth in people than we expected, and where inflation was higher than we expected coming out of the pandemic, I think if we make those investments, if we find a way to underpin our housing situation, that we get ourselves to a better place.
Optimism is completely the theme here. I tried to get you to get negative and you won't even do it. You still ended on optimism.
Well,
okay, so tell me, as we wrap up here, what is your optimistic ideal of a more competitive Canada? What does that look like? Paint me a picture.
What I always think about is, what does it take for someone who's 25 right now to look towards a future with excitement? And what do you want to have? I think you want to make sure that we have a society that allows people to get the opportunities that they want, that creates, you know, outcomes that are not necessarily equal, but that feel like there's been some sort of fair process to get those outcomes. You want to see technology that's not technology for technology's sake, but allows us to realize our dreams, maybe to make things happen faster, better, more innovation. And without some of the things that really worry you. You don't want it to be intrusive. You don't want it to be something that makes you scared. So it is about getting the balance and the governance of that technology. And you want to make sure this is a place where you can feel like you can pursue a great life. So it does mean we need to think about keeping our country worried about how we can be part of a climate agenda over the long term. There are certainly things that are happening that if I were 25, I would say, well, that looks more challenging than it looked for the generations before. So we'll need to think about what we do around adaptation and dealing with climate issues. They're real. And as a society, how we come together in order to address those things. These things are needed for people to feel optimistic about the future. The future will be different than the past. I mean, housing will look different in 25 years than it looks for the people that were with me when I was 25 years of age. The climate will look different. I mean, there's some inevitable things. Technology will create opportunities and risks. So you need to have eyes wide open. But the good news is we're coming from a very great starting point. And so I see lots of opportunity for the next generation, as long as we find a way to get people thinking that they need to make those investments in themselves and in our economy that, you know, creates a virtuous circle for us today and tomorrow.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much,
Great.
Bill.
Happy to be here.
Can I get you to sign my book?
Sure.